When we normally examine historical documents, we tend to expect them to function like a finalized architectural blueprint.
Right, like a static thing.
Exactly. You look at it, you see exactly where the load-bearing walls go, where the doors are positioned, the precise depth of the foundation.
Yeah, the architects signed off on the final revision, the ink dried, and it just stands as a fixed artifact of its time.
Right. It becomes a finished product that just, belongs under glass in a museum. You study it for what it was at the exact moment of its completion, without ever expecting it to change.
Right, but that is definitely not what we have today.
No, not at all. Because then you open up the archives of 19th century political history, and suddenly that blueprint starts shifting right in front of you.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, the walls are moving. The foundation is being violently rewritten in real time. The ink is still wet. And the entire time the authors are trying to construct this building, the ground beneath them is actively on fire.
It is the absolute definition of a living, breathing, and, frankly, highly combustible document.
It really is. So welcome, everyone, to today's deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Our mission today is to act as impartial historical detectives, and we are aiming our magnifying glass at one of the most historically significant, heavily debated, and explosive documents in modern history.
The Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels?
That's the one. But we aren't just reading the famous final draft.
No, we've got a lot more than that.
We have a massive stack of related foundational texts right in front of us. We are going to examine the early drafts, decades of subsequent prefaces, written as the world just, rapidly changed around the authors.
Right, and the fundamental updates they had to make based on real-world events, like the Paris Commune, for example.
Exactly. We are going to trace the precise evolution of a political theory.
We'll literally watch it transform from a secret underground questionnaire into a sweeping historical declaration that fundamentally altered the course of world history.
Now, before we jump in, I need to make something incredibly clear to you, the listener, because we are dealing with highly politically charged material here.
There be it charged.
Yeah. Material that has shaped revolutions, global conflicts, and entire geopolitical systems over the last century and a half. So our mission here requires a strict analytical framework.
Absolutely.
We aren't here to take sides. We aren't endorsing the theories. And we aren't condemning them either. Our goal is to strip away a century of modern political spin.
And all the subsequent historical baggage.
Right, and the decades of misinterpretation. We just want to impartially report on what the original source material actually says.
Yeah.
We want to understand the raw mechanics of the text itself, the specific historical context these two men were writing in, and the foundational ideas they were trying to communicate.
That analytical approach is so essential. I mean, whether one agrees or disagrees with the conclusions of this text, it is impossible to genuinely understand the political and economic landscape of the 20th or 21st centuries without understanding the exact arguments laid out in these pages.
Yeah, exactly.
We are treating the text as an artifact of its time, dissecting how it was built and, why it was built that way.
And regardless of where you stand on the politics, the document functions as an absolute masterclass in rhetorical framing. It established a vocabulary that still dictates how we debate economics, globalization, supply chains, and class dynamics today.
It really did.
But to understand how that framing was constructed, we have to start before the manifesto was even a manifesto.
Right, because it didn't just materialize out of thin air.
No, it wasn't a sudden flash of inspiration that Marx penned in a single afternoon at a cafe.
Yeah.
The sources reveal a process of rapid, calculated iteration.
Yeah, beginning with something that reads less like a political treatise and more like a religious initiation script.
It is such a striking origin story.
Right.
So to set the historical stage, in 1847, the organizations that Marx and Engels were involved with, groups like the League of the Just, which would shortly become the Communist League,
Right.
they were not public political parties. They were secret societies.
Completely underground. They were networks of exiled workers, radical intellectuals, and craftsmen operating entirely under the radar of deeply oppressive European monarchies.
Wow.
And because they were underground, their literature reflected the paranoia and the necessity of secrecy.
Which brings us to the early drafts we have here from 1847. There's the draft of a Communist Confession of Faith from June and the Principles of Communism from October. Both drafted primarily by Engels, by the way, but they don't look anything like a public declaration. They are formatted as a catechism.
which was actually an entirely conventional format for secret societies of that era.
Wait, really?
Yeah. A catechism, which is traditionally used by religious institutions to instill doctrine, is a very rigid, defensive question and answer structure. It is designed for rote memorization.
Okay, I see.
You ask a highly specific question, and the initiate recites a highly specific, predetermined answer. It ensures ideological purity within a closed sect operating in the shadows.
That makes sense. I actually have the Confession of Faith right here, and reading it, you can almost visualize a group of exiles in a dimly lit basement in London or Paris.
Oh, absolutely.
The very first question is incredibly blunt. It just says, "Are you a communist?" And the required answer is simply, yes.
Straight to the point.
Very. Question 2. What is the aim of the communists? Answer. To organize society in such a way that every member of it can develop and use all his capabilities and powers in complete freedom.
Right.
Is extremely methodical. Question 7. What is the proletariat?
It just walks the initiate through the ideology step by meticulous step.
And it's highly effective for ensuring that every member of the secret society is on exactly the same page.
Because of the police, right?
Exactly. If the Prussian police infiltrate your group, or if a member is interrogated, you want to know exactly what they believe and what they might say.
Yeah.
The catechism acts as a fixed anchor.
Right.
But while it's great for internal discipline, it is functionally useless for inspiring a mass public movement. Okay, let's unpack this, because this brings us to a fascinating piece of correspondence in our sources. It's November 24th, 1847. Engels writes a letter to Marx, and he proposes a fundamental tactical pivot.
A huge pivot.
He writes, I think we would do best to abandon the catechetical form and call the thing Communist Manifesto. Since a certain amount of history has to be narrated in it, the form hitherto adopted is quite unsuitable.
That letter basically marks the birth of modern political messaging as we know it.
Really?
Yeah. Engels realizes that a catechism is fundamentally static. It explains what the organization believes, but it doesn't explain the historical momentum that makes those beliefs necessary.
It has no narrative drive.
Exactly. A manifesto, conversely, is dynamic. It is a public declaration of intent. Engels is arguing that you cannot spark a world historical revolution with a pop quiz.
Right.
You need a narrative. You need a compelling, sweeping story that explains not just the mechanics of your proposed society, but the entire trajectory of human history that makes your movement feel not just right, but inevitable.
But there's a leap in logic there I want to examine. They decide to write a public manifesto. Why the sudden frantic rush in late 1847 and early 1848 to get this document printed?
The timing.
Yeah. If they're trying to lay out a comprehensive theory of human history and economics, why not take a year or two to write a meticulously researched academic treatise?
Well, because the political ground in Europe was literally trembling. The editorial introductions in our sources detail an absolute pressure cooker of a timeline.
How so?
So, at the Communist League Congress in London in late November 1847, Marx and Engels are officially commissioned to write a detailed theoretical and practical program for the party.
Okay.
Engels subsequently leaves for Paris, leaving Marx in Brussels to execute the drafting almost entirely alone throughout January 1848.
And the central authority of the Communist League is not politely waiting around.
No, they are not.
They are breathing down Marx's neck, sending him increasingly angry demands for the manuscript. They actually threaten to take punitive measures against him if he doesn't deliver it immediately.
And they were applying that pressure because they could read the geopolitical writing on the wall.
The pressure cooker.
Right. The political climate across Europe, from France to the German states to the Italian peninsula, it was at a boiling point. Years of economic depression, crop failures, and deep frustration with aristocratic rule had created a highly combustible atmosphere.
So Marx is just working frantically.
Frantically, synthesizing his deep economic research with Engels' earlier drafts, and by the end of January, the manuscript is finally dispatched to a London print shop owned by a German immigrant named J.E. Burgard.
And it rolls off the press at the end of February 1848 as a 23-page pamphlet in a dark green cover.
Yes.
The timing of that publication is almost cinematic. They rush the manuscript to the printer in London, and practically the moment the ink dries, the continent ignites.
It really did.
The February Revolution of 1848 breaks out in France, entirely overthrowing the monarchy of King Louis Philippe. And then, like dominoes, uprisings spread to Germany, Austria, Italy, Hungary.
The Spring of Nations.
Right, the spring of 1848 goes down in history as the Spring of Nations. The manifesto is published at the exact millisecond that the old feudal monarchic world of Europe is exploding.
And because Engels had convinced Marx to abandon the static catechism format, they were perfectly positioned to meet that explosive moment.
With a narrative.
Exactly. With a document that began with what is arguably the most famous and aggressive framing device in Western political literature. They didn't start with a question about the aims of communism. They started by reframing the entire history of the world.
Which moves us directly into the text of the Manifesto itself.
Hmm.
It famously opens with that haunting imagery. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism.
It's such a powerful opening.
It really is. It lists all the powers of old Europe, the Pope, the Tsar, French radicals, German police spies, who have united in a holy alliance to exorcise this specter.
Right.
But right after that dramatic prologue, the very first foundational premise of Chapter 1 is, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles.
It is a breathtakingly bold assertion. I mean, they are taking thousands of years of complex human civilization and reducing all of it to a single driving variable.
Just one thing.
Yeah. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman. They argue that in every epoch, society has been defined by the oppressor and the oppressed, standing in constant fundamental opposition to one another. Sometimes this fight is hidden, sometimes it is an open fight, but it is the permanent engine of historical change.
It's as if they are handing the reader a skeleton key and claiming it unlocks every single historical event. But I want to push back on that a bit.
Sure.
Because if you look at ancient Rome or the Middle Ages, those societies were incredibly complex. There weren't just two camps.
Sure.
Rome had patricians, knights, plebeians, slaves. The Middle Ages had feudal lords, vassals, guildmasters, apprentices, serfs. It was a massive multi-tiered hierarchy. Doesn't the idea of a simple binary struggle ignore the reality of the middle classes?
Well, Marx and Engels actually acknowledge that complexity in past epochs. They explicitly mention the complicated arrangements of society in earlier histories, the manifold gradations of social rank.
Okay.
But their core argument is that the modern era, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, the society that sprouted from the ruins of the feudal system, has fundamentally altered the architecture of that struggle.
How so?
They argue that modern capitalism hasn't done away with class antagonisms. Rather, it has simplified them.
Simplified them.
Right. The defining characteristic of the modern epoch is that society as a whole is increasingly splitting into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other.
The bourgeoisie and the proletariat.
Exactly. The bourgeoisie, who own the means of production, and the proletariat, the modern wage laborers, who own nothing but their ability to work. They argue the middle tiers are inevitably being squeezed out or absorbed into one of those two poles.
Okay, this brings us to a section of the text that presents a striking contradiction, one that often surprises first-time readers.
Oh, the praise for capitalism.
Yes. We generally culturally perceive this document as purely a vicious takedown of capitalism. But when you actually read Chapter 1, Marx and Engels spend a massive amount of ink absolutely praising the bourgeoisie.
They do.
It almost reads like a love letter to their historical achievements before it turns into a critique.
It is a deeply dialectical approach. Marx and Engels were historical materialists. They recognized that to effectively critique a system, you must first thoroughly understand and acknowledge its historical power and necessity.
Right.
They argue that the bourgeoisie has played a, quote, most revolutionary part in human history. They don't view capitalism as a mere mistake. They view it as a massive, necessary engine of progress that shattered the stagnation of feudalism.
I mean, listen to the sheer admiration in this quote. They write, "It has accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. It has conducted expeditions that put in the shade all former exoduses of nations and crusades."
It's high praise.
They are explicitly stating that the industrialists and capitalists of the 19th century have dwarfed the achievements of the pharaohs and the Roman emperors.
And they detail the precise mechanics of how the bourgeoisie achieved this. Wherever the bourgeoisie got the upper hand, they tore asunder the old, complex, patriarchal, feudal ties that bound people to their natural superiors. Under feudalism, relationships were defined by mutual obligations, religious duties, and fixed social stations. The bourgeoisie replaced all of that with naked self-interest.
Right.
They replaced the divine right of kings and the paternalism of the manor lord with what the text calls the icy water of egotistical calculation.
That phrase, the icy water of egotistical calculation, is so incredibly vivid.
It really is.
They are describing the process of stripping the sentimental halo off of every honored occupation. The physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science. Under the logic of the bourgeoisie, they are no longer revered figures of the community.
No, they're stripped of their mystique and transformed into paid wage laborers.
Even the sentimental veil of the family, they argue, was torn away and reduced to a mere money relation. Everything becomes transactional.
And while that sounds entirely critical, they simultaneously view this stripping away of illusions as historically progressive.
Progressive, how?
Because by washing away the religious and political illusions of the feudal era, the bourgeoisie forces humanity to face its real conditions of existence with sober senses.
Oh, I see.
The exploitation is no longer hidden behind religious justification. It is direct, brutal, and visible, which makes it possible to finally fight it.
You know, when reading their description of the bourgeoisie's relentless need for expansion, it's impossible not to draw an analytical parallel to the modern culture of technological disruption.
Oh, absolutely.
The bourgeoisie are portrayed almost like the ultimate Silicon Valley disruptors of the 1840s. They cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, which means they are constantly upending all social relations.
Move fast and break things.
Exactly. There is a beautifully poetic line here. All fixed, fast frozen relations, with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions, are swept away. All new formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. It is the ultimate description of that disruption.
It is the defining engine of modernity. The need for a constantly expanding market chases the bourgeoisie over the entire surface of the globe. They must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere.
Globalization.
Exactly. They are describing the precise mechanics of early globalization. And here the text introduces a critical concept regarding how they conquer the globe. It isn't just through military force.
Right, what is it?
It is through the heavy artillery of cheap commodities.
Yes. The text says the cheap prices of their commodities are the heavy artillery with which they batter down all Chinese walls, with which they force the barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate.
It's an economic conquest?
They force all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. They essentially tell the rest of the world, like, you either industrialize and play our game, or we will bury you with cheap, mass-produced goods that destroy your local economies.
They create a world after its own image.
Exactly.
They centralize the means of production, they agglomerate the population into enormous, unprecedented industrial cities, and they concentrate property into a few hands.
The scale is massive.
It is. They conjure massive productive forces out of the ground. Steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, the clearing of entire continents for cultivation. Marx and Engels are standing in 1848, witnessing this unprecedented explosion of industry, and they are genuinely in awe of the sheer productive capacity that this class has unleashed upon the world.
But, and here's the turn, with this relentless, awe-inspiring disruption comes a fatal structural flaw. You have these brilliant disruptors building this massive interconnected engine of global production. The central analytical question the text then poses is, what happens when these architects build a machine so vast and powerful that they can no longer control its internal logic?
That is the exact turning point of their entire historical narrative. We move seamlessly from the triumph of the bourgeoisie to the inevitable crisis of the bourgeoisie.
And to illustrate this, they deploy an incredible metaphor.
The sorcerer's apprentice.
Yes.
Yeah.
They compare modern bourgeois society, with its gigantic means of production and exchange, to a sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld whom he has called up by his spells.
The machinery has outgrown the wizard.
The bourgeoisie summoned the immense forces of modern industry, but now those forces have grown too vast, too powerful, and too wild to be managed by the narrow, restrictive constraints of private property and free competition.
But Marx and Engels aren't just making a poetic claim here. They point to a specific, recurring economic mechanism to prove that the sorcerer has lost control.
Right. They point to the commercial crises.
The crises that periodically shake the entire society, what we would call recessions or depressions. And they specifically identify the cause, as an epidemic of overproduction.
Okay, I really want to dig into the mechanics of this because it sounds deeply counterintuitive.
It is.
How exactly does producing too much cause a societal crisis? I mean, in earlier epochs, if a society collapsed, if there was a famine, it was always caused by scarcity.
Exactly. A drought ruined the crops, a plague wiped out the workforce, a war destroyed the grain stores.
People starved because there physically wasn't enough food to go around.
And that is the profound paradox of capitalism that Marx and Engels are identifying. Under the bourgeois system, society is periodically thrown into a state of momentary barbarism, not because of scarcity, but because of abundance.
Wait, abundance?
Yes. It appears as if a famine or a war of devastation has suddenly cut off the supply of every means of subsistence. But the actual underlying cause is that there's too much civilization, too much industry, too much commerce, too much food.
Let's trace that cycle, because it's fascinating. Under capitalism, factories mass-produce goods to maximize profit.
Right.
But because they are paying their workers the absolute minimum wage required to survive, the workers, who make up the vast majority of population, eventually cannot afford to buy back the massive amount of goods they are producing. So the warehouses just fill up with unsold coats, unsold shoes, unsold grain.
Exactly. The productive forces have become too powerful for the conditions of bourgeois property. The system produces vastly more wealth than the system of wage labor can distribute.
Wow.
Because the goods can't be sold for a profit, the factories shut down, the workers are laid off. Without wages, the workers can buy even less, leading to more factories shutting down.
Good downward spiral.
A total spiral. You have people starving outside of warehouses that are literally overflowing with food simply because the food cannot be sold at a price that generates a profit for the owner. It is an absurdity unique to the capitalist epoch.
And how does the bourgeoisie solve these crises? The text says they do it by the enforced destruction of a mass of productive forces, literally destroying goods, burning crops, or letting factories rust. And by conquering new markets to dump the excess goods, or more thoroughly exploiting the old ones. But by doing so, they are only treating the symptom. They are paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises in the future, while diminishing the means whereby crises are prevented.
They're essentially running out of planet to conquer.
Right.
And this structural instability brings us to the human element. The bourgeoisie didn't just forge the economic weapons that bring death to itself. They called into existence the specific class of men who are inevitably going to wield those weapons.
A modern working class.
Yeah.
The proletarian.
Exactly.
The text defines the proletariat very specifically. They are a class of laborers who live only so long as they find work, and they find work only so long as their labor increases capital. But I want to examine the historical novelty of this. Because haven't there always been poor working classes? Haven't there always been people at the bottom of the social pyramid doing the heavy lifting?
Of course.
So how does the text differentiate a modern proletarian in a 19th century factory from a slave in ancient Rome or a serf in the Middle Ages?
That is a crucial distinction. And to understand the precise mechanics of why the proletariat is unique, we actually need to look back at the earlier drafts.
The ones by Engels.
Specifically, the Principles of Communism from late 1847. In those drafts, Engels lays out the deep anatomical differences between the proletarian and historical workers with incredible clarity. He addresses the exact question of the slave versus the proletarian.
I'm looking at question 10 from the Confession of Faith. In what way does the proletarian differ from the slave? What is the economic mechanism that separates them?
Engels writes that the slave is sold once and for all. Because the slave is the legal property of one specific master, their physical existence, however wretched and brutal it may be, is mathematically guaranteed by the master's own self-interest.
Because it's an investment.
Exactly. If the master wants their property to continue generating value, they must feed and house the slave.
Right.
The proletarian, however, is not the property of one individual master. They are legally free. But because they own nothing, they have to sell themselves daily and hourly on the open market.
Daily and hourly.
They are essentially the property of the entire bourgeois class, and because they are only hired when it is profitable, their existence is completely unassured. If the market dips and no one needs their labor today, they simply starve.
It's such a dark irony. The text notes that the slave counts as a thing, not a recognized member of civil society. But the proletarian is recognized as a legal person, a free member of civil society. Yet, economically, the slave actually has a more secure physical existence than the free proletarian. precisely because the proletarian is subjected entirely to the brutal vagaries of free competition and market fluctuations.
And Engels makes a similar comparison with the medieval serf. In question 11, he explains that the serf has the guaranteed use of an instrument of production, a specific piece of land.
In return for handing over a portion of the yield to the lord.
Right. The serf is tied to the land, but that means they have a guaranteed source of survival. They give up a product. But the proletarian works with the enormous instruments of production belonging to someone else and receives a portion of the product back in the form of wages.
A wage determined purely by how many other desperate workers are competing for the same job.
Exactly.
So the serf has an assured existence, the proletarian does not. The serf stands outside the mechanism of competition. The proletarian is thrown directly into the meat grinder of it.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Furthermore, the manifesto details how the extensive use of machinery and the extreme division of labor have stripped the work of the proletarian of all individual character or charm. The medieval artisan took pride in crafting a whole shoe. The proletarian just pulls a lever on a machine that makes shoe soles thousands of times a day.
The text famously says the worker becomes a mere appendage of the machine.
Right. And because the work is so simple, the cost of producing a worker is reduced almost entirely to the absolute minimum cost of the basic food needed to keep them alive and breeding.
And as the repulsiveness of the work increases, the wage decreases. They are organized like soldiers in a sprawling industrial army. They're enslaved daily and hourly by the machine, by the overlooker, and above all, by the individual bourgeois manufacturer himself.
And the ranks of this industrial army are constantly swelling.
Oh, massively. The lower strata of the middle class, the small tradespeople, the handicraftsmen, the peasants, they all sink gradually into the proletariat.
Because they just can't compete.
Because their minuscule capital cannot possibly compete with the giant modern industries, and their specialized skills are rendered worthless by new methods of production. The proletariat is recruited from all classes of the population.
But the text notes that their struggle against the bourgeoisie goes through stages of evolution. At first, they fight blindly, individually.
Right.
Then the workers of a single factory might rebel. They direct their attacks not just against the bourgeois conditions of production, but against the instruments themselves. They smash the machinery, they burn down the factories, desperately trying to restore by force the vanished status of the medieval workman.
But that is a reactionary phase. Eventually, the sheer massive development of industry concentrates the proletariat into greater masses. Their strength grows, and they begin to feel that strength. And ironically, the bourgeoisie itself provides the tools for their organization.
The improved means of communication.
Specifically, the railways. They place the workers of different localities in contact with one another.
The text points out that what took the burghers of the Middle Ages centuries to achieve with miserable dirt highways, the modern proletarians can achieve in a few years, thanks to the railway network.
Right.
They can coordinate across cities, across borders. And the bourgeoisie, because it is constantly battling the old aristocracy or foreign economic rivals, is forced to appeal to the proletariat for political help.
They drag the workers into the political arena.
They essentially hand them the weapons for their own political education.
Exactly. The conclusion Marx and Engels draw from this mechanical analysis is that the bourgeoisie produces, above all, its own gravediggers.
Gravediggers.
The fall of the bourgeoisie and the victory of the proletariat are posited not just as moral necessities, but as inevitable scientific outcomes of the economic system itself.
The sorcerer's spells have generated an army of gravediggers. So what exactly do these gravediggers, represented theoretically by the communists, intend to do once they unite, realize their power, and seize control?
That leads us directly into the deep rhetorical combat of Chapter 2, Proletarians and Communists.
Because once the text declares this inevitable violent revolution, it has to immediately deal with the profound panic, the moral outrage, and the fierce objections coming from the middle and upper classes.
Oh, the panic was real. Chapter 2 is largely constructed as a brilliant rhetorical defense mechanism. Marx and Engels anticipate every major pearl-clutching objection the bourgeoisie is going to hurl at them.
Accusations regarding property, the family, culture, nationality.
And they systematically dismantle them. They don't just deny the accusations. They use a form of rhetorical aikido.
Rhetorical aikido, I love that.
They step into the attack, absorb the opponent's momentum, and flip the premise entirely. They use the bourgeoisie's own logic to prove that capitalism is already guilty of the crimes they're accusing communism of.
Okay, let's look closely at the mechanics of that rhetorical aikido. The first, and overwhelmingly the biggest objection, is regarding property.
Naturally.
The accusation is simple. You communists want to abolish private property. You want to take away what I own. But the text makes a highly precise economic distinction.
Yes, it does.
They state that the defining feature of communism is not the abolition of property generally, but the abolition of bourgeois private property.
Correct. They interrogate the accusation. They ask the bourgeois critic, like, do you mean the hard-won, personally acquired property of the petty artisan or the small peasant farmer?
Right.
The communists don't need to abolish that, they argue, because the brutal development of modern industrial capitalism has already destroyed it. It is destroying it daily.
To use a modern analogy, they are effectively saying, we don't need to orchestrate a plot to take the small mom-and-pop hardware store's property. Amazon and Walmart supply chains already drove them into bankruptcy and seized their market share.
Exactly. Capitalism itself is the great destroyer of small personal property.
Wow.
The only property the communists seek to abolish is capital, this specific kind of property that exploits wage labor to increase itself. And they unpack the philosophical nature of capital. They argue that capital is not a personal power. It is a social power. A massive factory isn't built or run by one wealthy man. It is created and set in motion by the united cooperative action of thousands of workers, of the entire society. Therefore, when capital is converted into common property, it isn't a theft of personal belongings. It is simply changing the social character of the property. It loses its class character and reverts to the society that actually generated it.
It's a brilliant pivot. But then they face the objections that get highly personal and visceral.
Oh yeah, the family.
The bourgeoisie accuses them, you are going to destroy the family.
The text acknowledges this, noting abolition of the family, even the most radical flare-up at this infamous proposal of the communists.
And here's the Aikido again. They refuse to apologize or backtrack. Instead, they attack the premise. They ask, on what foundation is the present bourgeois family based?
And their answer is that it is based on capital, on private gain. Right. They argue that the bourgeoisie has already destroyed the authentic family structure for the vast majority of the population by reducing the proletarian family to a mere money relation.
Right, because when children are forced to work 14 hours a day in a textile mill to keep the family from starving, the parent-child relationship is fundamentally corrupted.
Completely corrupted.
The children are transformed into simple articles of commerce and instruments of labor. The text argues that the bourgeois claptrap about the hallowed, sacred correlation of parent and child becomes physically disgusting when contrasted with the brutal reality of child labor in the factories.
The bourgeoisie destroyed the family long before the communists showed up.
And then they tackle an even more scandalous, explosive accusation. The claim that communists want to introduce a community of women, meaning they want to make women communal property.
This is where Marx and Engels deploy absolutely biting, venomous sarcasm, which is fascinating to read in a 19th century political document.
It really is.
They point out that the bourgeois sees his wife primarily as a mere instrument of production, a vessel for producing legitimate heirs to inherit his capital. So when the bourgeois hears that instruments of production are to be exploited in common under communism, he naturally assumes that women will fall to the same communal fate.
He cannot even fathom that the real stated goal of the communists is to do away with the status of women as mere instruments of production entirely.
And they don't stop at defending themselves. They go on a ferocious offensive.
Right.
They write that the bourgeois, not content with having the wives and daughters of their proletarians at their disposal, referencing the immense power dynamics and exploitation in the factories, take the greatest pleasure in seducing each other's wives. They declare that bourgeois marriage is, in reality, already a system of wives in common, just hypocritically concealed behind Victorian morality. The communists, they argue, merely want to replace this hypocritically concealed system of prostitution and affairs with an open, honest system by abolishing the fundamental economic conditions that force women into financial subjection to men.
It's a complete, devastating inversion of the moral panic. And they do the exact same thing with the concept of patriotism and nationality. When accused of wanting to abolish countries and borders, they state flatly, quote, "The working men have no country. We cannot take from them what they have not got."
Because the mechanics of modern industrial labor, the subjection to capital, are identical whether you are in a factory in England, France, America, or Germany.
Right.
Capital has already stripped the worker of every trace of unique national character. Furthermore, they argue that national differences and antagonisms between peoples are already daily vanishing, owing to the development of the global bourgeoisie, the world market, and the uniformity in the mode of production.
Which brings us to the ultimate perennial capitalist defense. Here's where it gets really interesting. The argument concerning human nature and motivation. The universal laziness argument.
Ah, yes. This is perhaps the most enduring objection they address. The bourgeoisie claims, it has been objected that upon the abolition of private property, all work will cease and universal laziness will overtake us.
The premise is that if you remove the prospect of hoarding immense personal wealth, why would anyone ever get out of bed and do the hard work required to keep society running?
And their counter to this is an absolutely devastating logical trap.
Mhm.
They say, if this logic were actually true, bourgeois society ought long ago to have gone to the dogs through sheer idleness.
Why?
Because under the capitalist system, those of its members who work acquire nothing, and those who acquire anything do not work.
It completely dismantles the premise. They're pointing out the glaring hypocrisy. If the accumulation of wealth is the sole biological motivator for human labor, then why do the people who perform the most grueling, physically devastating labor in society own the least, while those who own the most perform none of the actual physical labor?
The bourgeoisie's objection, they argue, is just a tautology. There can no longer be any wage labor when there is no longer any capital.
They're essentially holding up a mirror to the ruling class and saying, your grand philosophical ideas of freedom, culture, jurisprudence, and human nature are not universal truths.
They are just the intellectual outgrowth of your specific temporary economic conditions.
Your law is just the will of your class made into a law for all. You have transformed your historical, temporary mode of production into an eternal law of nature and reason, engaging in the exact same self-delusion as the feudal lords and the ancient slave owners before you.
Having successfully cleared the ideological battlefield with these rebuttals, the text is obligated to deliver on the practical front. Philosophy and critique are not enough for a movement declaring a revolution.
Right. What is the actual concrete roadmap? What are the communists going to mechanically do on day one of seizing political power?
This brings us to the famous 10-point plan and their critique of rival movements in Chapter 3. Having laid out this sweeping historical vision, Chapter 2 concludes with a highly specific, concrete, step-by-step political program meant for the most advanced industrial countries of 1848.
Yes, 10 specific measures. And they are intellectually honest about the nature of these measures. They openly acknowledge that these points will involve despotic inroads on the rights of property and on the conditions of bourgeois production.
They are not hiding the fact that this requires state coercion against the owning class, but they argue these despotic inroads are unavoidable as a means of entirely revolutionizing the mode of production.
Let's break down the economic mechanics of some of these 10 points. Number 1, abolition of property and land and application of all rents of land to public purposes.
Number 2, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax.
Number 3, abolition of all rights of inheritance. Number 5, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank.
Number 6, centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state.
And number 10 is free education for all children in public schools and the abolition of children's factory labor in its present form.
What's deeply fascinating here is examining this list from our vantage point over a century and a half later. In 1848, these demands were considered radically, terrifyingly revolutionary.
Enough to get you exiled or executed.
Exactly. Yet today, a heavy progressive income tax, centralization of national banks, and free public education for children are standard, institutionalized, deeply mundane features of almost every modern functioning capitalist democracy on Earth.
It's true. The bourgeois system ended up adopting points 2, 5, and 10 simply to stabilize itself and keep the machinery running efficiently.
You need educated workers to run complex machines, and you need central banks to mitigate the very crises of overproduction Marx described.
Right. Meanwhile, point 1, the total abolition of private land property, and point 3, the absolute abolition of inheritance, remained radically outside the bounds of the capital system.
Because abolishing inheritance would destroy the generational accumulation of capital, which is the lifeblood of the bourgeois class.
Right. This blend of the achievable and the radically utopian provided a concrete, actionable political platform for the workers of 1848. But Marx and Engels weren't just fighting the bourgeoisie, they were fighting a brutal war on two fronts.
They were. They were simultaneously fighting other left-wing intellectuals and socialist factions for control of the working class narrative.
Which makes Chapter 3 of the Manifesto essentially a giant, hyper-intellectual diss track against every other left-wing reformist or radical thinker of the 19th century.
A diss track. That's a great way to put it.
They divide socialist and communist literature into three distinct categories to prove mathematically why their specific brand of scientific communism is the only legitimate path forward and why all the others are dangerous dead ends.
They systematically critique reactionary socialism, conservative or bourgeois socialism, and critical utopian socialism. And their analysis of reactionary socialism, particularly the subcategory of feudal socialism, is incredibly sharp and historically perceptive.
Let's examine the mechanics of feudal socialism. The text describes how the old aristocracies of France and England, the lords, the dukes, the royalists, who had been completely ruined, outcompeted, and pushed aside by the rising industrial bourgeoisie, tried to strike back.
But they couldn't fight a serious physical or political battle anymore because the economic base had shifted.
So they fought a literary one. To arouse sympathy and gain allies, these aristocrats pretended to forget their own class interests and formulated an indictment against the bourgeoisie, supposedly entirely in the interest of the exploited working class.
It is the pinnacle of political cynicism. The old feudal lords, whose entire historical existence was based on brutally oppressing and extracting labor from the serfs, suddenly positioned themselves as the great empathetic champions of the modern proletarian.
Because both groups mutually hated the new capitalist factory boss.
Exactly. Marx writes that the aristocrats took their revenge by singing lampoons on their new masters and whispering sinister prophecies of coming economic catastrophe into their ears.
I love the visual analogy the text uses to mock this movement. I picture a deposed, powdered king trying to lead a gritty peasant revolt.
Yes.
The text says the aristocracy waved the proletarian alms bag in front for a banner to rally the people. But the people, so often as they joined them, saw on their hindquarters the old feudal coats of arms and deserted with loud and irreverent laughter.
It's a brilliant, humiliating visual, and Marx points out the fundamental flaw in their logic. These feudal socialists forget that the modern bourgeoisie is the direct, necessary offspring of their own feudal society.
They incubated the very class that destroyed them.
Furthermore, in practical political reality, whenever there is an actual uprising, these supposedly pro-worker aristocrats immediately join the bourgeoisie in all coercive, violent measures against the working class.
Right.
And in ordinary life, despite their high-minded aristocratic phrases, they gladly stoop to pick up the golden apples dropped by industry, bartering truth, love, and honor for lucrative traffic in wool, beetroot, sugar, and potato spirits.
It exposes the entire charade. But then they move to critique conservative or bourgeois socialism. And this section feels incredibly relevant to modern political discourse.
Oh, very relevant.
They argue that a part of the bourgeoisie is genuinely desirous of redressing social grievances, but only in order to secure the continued existence of bourgeois society. Who belongs to this group? The text lists economists, philanthropists, humanitarians, organizers of charity, members of societies for the prevention of cruelty to animals, temperance fanatics, and hole and corner reformers of every imaginable kind.
This is their ruthless critique of the liberal reformer. The bourgeois socialist wants to maintain the mechanics of capitalism without the negative, destabilizing side effects. The text explicitly cites Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, a prominent anarchist and socialist thinker of the time, as an example. Marx argues that the socialistic bourgeois want all the advantages of modern social conditions, the wealth, the factories, the global trade networks, without the struggles, the poverty, and the revolutionary dangers that inherently result from those conditions.
They wish for a bourgeoisie without a proletariat.
Exactly.
They want the workers to march straight into the social New Jerusalem, but they really just want them to cast away their hateful, revolutionary ideas concerning the bourgeoisie. They want the working class to accept their lot in life, but be slightly more comfortable.
And the ultimate damning summation of this bourgeois socialism, according to Marx and Engels, is encapsulated in the phrase, "The bourgeois is a bourgeois for the benefit of the working class."
For the benefit of the working class.
Right. They advocate for free trade, claiming it is for the benefit of the working class. They advocate for protective duties for the benefit of the working class. Prison reform for the benefit of the working class.
It is an attempt to put a humanitarian band-aid over a severed artery, trying to patch up the structural contradictions of capitalism without fundamentally altering the property relations.
Finally, they aim their sights at the critical utopian socialists, thinkers like Saint Simon, Fourier, and Robert Owen.
Now, Marx and Engels acknowledged that these men were pioneers. They saw the class antagonisms very early on.
True.
But because the proletariat was still in its historical infancy when these men were writing, the utopians didn't see the workers as an independent, capable political force. They just saw them as the most suffering class, a passive group needing to be saved from above.
So instead of analyzing the historical ground-up mechanics of class struggle, the utopians tried to invent new, perfect social laws from thin air. They contrived perfect utopian communities, phalansteries, and home colonies, and tried to implement them from the top down.
Because they needed immense funding to build these experimental castles in the air, they constantly appealed to the philanthropy and the wallets of the ruling class.
And by relying on the ruling class, they naturally violently opposed any actual disruptive political action or strikes by the working class. They devolved from pioneers into reactionary, isolated sects.
So Chapter 2 gives us the specific 10-point roadmap, and Chapter 3 meticulously clears the intellectual field of all rivals. Reading it, the text feels incredibly confident. It feels like a finished, finalized blueprint for the incoming revolution of 1848.
It possesses the supreme confidence of theory. But theory must inevitably collide with the chaotic reality of history.
Yes, it must.
And this brings us to one of the most vital, fascinating aspects of our source material: the subsequent prefaces and how the bloody reality of the Paris Commune forced Marx and Engels to radically alter their own blueprint.
Right, because 1848 happened. The revolution swept across Europe, thrones toppled, and then they were brutally crushed.
Brutally.
The bourgeoisie and the old aristocracy found common ground in their terror of the working class, consolidated their power, and struck back. The Communist League was hunted down, its leaders were tried and imprisoned in the Cologne Communist Trial of 1852, and the League was dissolved.
For a moment, the Manifesto seemed doomed to be a forgotten relic of a failed uprising.
But the underlying economic engine, the industrial proletariat, kept growing exponentially. The conditions hadn't been resolved. In 1864, the International Working Men's Association is formed, bringing the movement back to life. And by 1872, the movement has grown so large that a new German edition of the Manifesto is required. Marx and Engels sit down to write a new preface. And what they write is stunning, especially for two authors who were notoriously stubborn and fiercely defensive of their work.
They read an official preface basically admitting that their perfect 10-point plan is outdated.
Outdated.
They state explicitly in the 1872 preface, no special stress is laid on the revolutionary measures proposed at the end of Section 2. That passage would, in many respects, be very differently worded today. They concede that, given the immense growth of modern industry, the political program has, in some details, been antiquated.
And we have to examine why they declare it antiquated.
Right.
It wasn't just the passage of time. They explicitly cite the practical experience gained in the February Revolution of 1848 and, exponentially more importantly, the world-shaping events of the Paris Commune of 1871.
The Paris Commune. This is the historical earthquake that permanently shifts the foundation of their entire political blueprint.
For 2 whole months in the spring of 1871, following the collapse of the French government during the Franco-Prussian War, the proletariat of Paris actually seized political power.
They took over the capital city of France.
And watching this experiment unfold completely and permanently changed Marx's understanding of the state.
We have the crucial excerpt here from Marx's The Civil War in France, his address to the International written in May 1871, just as the Commune was falling. This is where he explains the profound theoretical shift.
What was the shift?
Initially, in the 1848 Manifesto, the idea was relatively straightforward. The proletariat would raise itself to the position of ruling class, capture the existing state apparatus, and use it to centralize credit, transport, and production. The goal was to take the steering wheel of the existing government.
But after closely observing the Paris Commune, Marx concludes something totally different. He writes his famous correction: the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes.
We must ask, why not? Why can't the workers just take over the existing government buildings, sit in the existing parliamentary chairs, and start issuing communist decrees?
Right.
Marx analyzes the architecture of the state to answer this. He explains that the centralized state power, the standing army, the ubiquitous police force, the massive bureaucracy, The clergy, the judicature, was originally created by the absolute monarchy and then honed and perfected by the bourgeoisie as an engine of class despotism.
An engine of class despotism.
Its very architecture, its hierarchical chain of command, its reliance on violence, its separation from the daily life of the masses is specifically designed for enslavement, repression, and the protection of capital.
So you cannot use a machine intricately designed for oppression to manufacture liberation. It will always default to its original purpose.
Exactly.
So if they could just capture the state, what did the workers of the Paris Commune actually do? They didn't just take over the state, they actively shattered it.
Shattered it.
The very first decree of the Commune was the complete suppression of the standing army, replacing it with the armed people, the National Guard. They stripped the police force of its political attributes and turned it into a revocable, responsible agent of the Commune.
They actively dismantled the mechanisms of elite control. They removed the sham independence of magistrates and judges, stripping them of their lifelong appointments and making them elective, responsible, and revocable by the people.
Wow.
And crucially, a point Marx emphasizes heavily, from the members of the Commune downwards, all public service had to be done at a workman's wage.
But workman's wage.
The immense vested interests, the massive salaries, and the representation allowances of high state dignitaries completely disappeared. Government ceased to be a lucrative career for the elite.
They also attacked the ideological apparatus. They broke the spiritual force of repression, what Marx calls the parson power, by disestablishing and disendowing all churches as proprietary bodies. They opened all educational institutions to the people gratuitously, entirely free from interference by either church or state. And they enacted actual, immediate social changes. They abolished night work for journeyman bakers, and they put a hard stop to the practice of employers levying arbitrary fines on workers as a backdoor way to reduce wages.
Marx watched this and saw not a romantic reproduction of medieval communes, but a completely new, unprecedented political form. He called it the political form at last discovered under which to work out the economical emancipation of labor. He realized that the bourgeois state couldn't be captured. It had to be amputated and replaced with direct participatory democracy.
This was a massive fundamental revision to the political theory of the original 1848 Manifesto, and it was forced upon them by the actual messy lived experience of the working class in the streets of Paris.
Which demonstrates that the Manifesto was never intended to be a static religious text. Marx and Engels were functioning as historical scientists. They were constantly observing the chaotic data of world events, running it through their analytical framework, and updating their hypotheses in real time.
Absolutely. And you see this constant, rigorous evolution in the other prefaces included in our sources. Look at the 1882 preface to the Russian edition.
Ah, yes.
In 1848, Russia and the United States were barely factors in the Manifesto. They were considered massive, silent pillars of the old European system, providing raw materials and absorbing excess population. But by 1882, the geopolitical landscape has inverted.
Completely inverted.
The U.S. is rapidly industrializing, breaking the industrial monopoly of Western Europe, and Russia, the former bastion of reaction, has formed the vanguard of revolutionary action in Europe.
And because of this shift, the 1882 Russian preface ponders a totally new, mind-bending theoretical question. Marx and Engels note that in Russia, more than half the land is still owned in common by the peasants in an ancient, primitive communal form called the Obshchina.
The question they have to answer is, can this Russian communal land pass directly into the higher form of communist ownership? Or does Russia have to suffer through the entire miserable, brutal, decades-long process of capitalist industrialization first, dissolving the Obshchina, just like the West did?
It's a profound question about the nature of historical materialism. Is history a strictly linear track that every single nation must travel identically, step by step?
Right.
Their answer in 1882 was highly conditional and nuanced. They said, if the Russian Revolution becomes the signal for a proletarian revolution in the West, so that both complement each other, the present Russian common ownership of land may serve as the starting point for a communist development.
They were trying to chart a theoretical path that didn't strictly require every nation on Earth to pass through the brutal meat grinder of Victorian capitalism to reach the end goal.
It demonstrates how incredibly global their thinking had become. The text wasn't just a German document anymore. It was translating and spreading everywhere, adapting to local contexts.
The prefaces track its journey like a map of industrialization. A Danish edition, a French edition, a Polish edition published in Geneva.
Engels makes a brilliant observation in the 1892 Polish edition. He notes that you can accurately measure the development of large-scale industry in a country simply by counting how many copies of the manifesto are circulating in its native language.
That's a fascinating metric.
As Congress, Poland industrialized and the proletariat grew, the demand for the Polish manifesto naturally surged.
And in the 1893 Italian edition preface, written near the end of his life, Engels looks back at the revolutions of 1848 in Italy and Germany. He notes the tragic irony that while the working men fought and died on the barricades, the political and economic fruits of their sacrifice were ultimately reaped by the capitalists because the economic conditions weren't ripe yet for a true social revolution. But he argues that by unifying those nations and building modern industries, the capitalists unknowingly created a concentrated, powerful proletariat, paving the way for the future. He even ends that preface by honoring Dante, the first poet of modern times, and wondering poetically if Italy will produce a new Dante to mark the birth of the new proletarian era.
It's an incredibly sweeping, epic scale of historical thinking. The text tracks the entire history of the 19th century itself.
From a small, secretive league of German craftsmen hiding in London, drafting a simple Q&A catechism about what is communism,
to a living document published in Polish, Danish, Russian, Italian, Armenian, and American publications, acting as the foundational common program for millions of workers from the frozen expanses of Siberia to the gold fields of California.
We have spent this time exploring the dense sources behind one of history's most volatile and consequential texts. We've seen the precise mechanics of how it morphed from that static catechism into a sweeping historical narrative.
We've analyzed the dialectical approach that praised the bourgeoisie for building the miraculous modern world, while simultaneously condemning them for reducing the entirety of human life to the icy water of egotistical calculation.
We examined the counterintuitive paradox of crises caused by an epidemic of overproduction,
The specific economic mechanics of the 10-point practical program,
the fierce, sarcastic critiques of rival socialists who just wanted to put a Band-Aid on the system,
and how the bloody reality of the Paris Commune forced the authors to drastically revise their fundamental understanding of state power.
But if we connect all of this extensive history and theory back to you, the listener, why does understanding the specific mechanics of this text matter today? Why meticulously read a document drafted in 1848?
Because the vocabulary established in this text, the concepts of class interests, the commodification of human labor, the relentless disruptive globalization of markets, the specific idea of technology and machinery displacing workers to lower wages, these concepts still underpin exactly how we debate the economy today.
Whether you are studying history, analyzing modern economic policy, or just trying to decipher the underlying narratives of the evening news, the analytical framework of tracking who owns the means of production and how that ownership shapes political power and social relations is simply inescapable.
You cannot fully comprehend the architecture of the modern political landscape without understanding the rhetorical framing this document invented. The questions it raised about the concentration of wealth and the instability of global markets remain unresolved.
Which leads me to a final provocative thought I want to leave you with, something to mull over on your own that builds logically on the mechanics we've explored today.
Let's hear it.
Throughout the text, Marx and Engels explicitly and repeatedly argue that the bourgeoisie, driven purely by the blind egotistical hunt for profit, accidentally built the exact immense infrastructure needed for a unified global society. To chase markets, they laid the transoceanic telegraph cables, they built the continental railroads, they forced the disparate corners of the world into a single, tightly interconnected market. They forged the incredible tools of their own potential obsolescence.
Right.
As you look at today's hyper-connected, AI-driven, algorithmic, instantly globalized world, you have to ask yourself a deeply structural question. Are the immense, unprecedented technological leaps we are living through right now merely creating the ultimate tools for a never-before-seen concentration of wealth in the hands of a few tech billionaires? Or, much like the sorcerer's apprentice in 1848, who summoned forces he couldn't control, are these massive supply chains and communication networks quietly, accidentally building the exact material infrastructure required for a completely different way of organizing human survival and resource distribution? A system we haven't even fully conceptualized yet.
Are we looking at a finalized, inescapable blueprint of the future?
Or is the foundation shifting violently beneath our feet while the building is once again on fire?
It is the ultimate structural question, and it is one that history is actively still trying to answer.
Thank you for joining us on this extensive deep dive into the sources. Stay curious, keep reading, and we'll see you next time.